Hi, welcome to this session on where advertising meets technology, in which we'll be discussing how the UK digital advertising industry has been piloting blockchain technology, or DLT, to address the challenges of trust and transparency in the online digital advertising ecosystem. So on the panel today, you have myself, Jules Kendrick. I'm the MD UK and Europe of the Trustworthy Accountability Group, known as TAG. We also have Tim Brown. Tim, give us a wave. Tim is the CEO of Fiducia, and then we have Nigel Vaz, who's the Global CEO of Publicis Sapient and also the current IPA President. So just by way of introduction, the Trustworthy Accountability Group, TAG, is the leading global certification program fighting criminal activity and increasing trust in the digital advertising industry. TAG's mission is to eliminate fraudulent traffic, combat malware, prevent internet piracy, and promote greater transparency and brand safety in digital advertising. A bit of an explain is required because actually as of the 1st of September, TAG merged with JICWebs, which I was previously running. JICWebs was a UK cross-industry, not-for-profit, self-regulatory organisation defining best practices and standards for online ad trading in the UK. And so we basically merged to become one single entity, which is called TAG, doing basically everything I just mentioned, but as one company, offering one set of global standards to the digital ad industry. So our remit as a global entity is to address the trust and transparency challenges the industry is facing. This includes assessing how new technologies can help the industry continue to self-regulate through standards and best practices, and to ensure they're enforced at all times, consistently, and by all industry participants across the supply chain. So transparency in digital advertising supply chain is critical to its sustainable future, and much work has already been done. We've been very successful in many ways to achieve that, not least through TAG and JICWeb's brand safety and fraud standards, and also the industry's trade associations, but there's still much to be done. There was a recent PwC study commissioned by ISBA, the trade body for advertisers, and AOP for digital publishers, which highlighted the complexity of the programmatic supply chain and the need for industry consistency around data sharing and formatting. And the digital ad industry is very aware of the growing pressure from regulators to prove the compliance and accountability of digital advertising. So back in 2018, the four trade bodies that owned JICWebs, which was ISBA for advertisers, AOP for digital publishers, IPA for the agencies, and IAB for the digital ad industry as a whole, were interested in looking how distributed ledger technology, DLT, could help address the industry's trust and transparency challenges. The idea was to look at how an industry-wide collaborative environment could gain better control on how defined standards, certifications, and regulations could be enforced consistently at all times across the supply chain, making all industry participants accountable. To this end, JICWebs, as was, started a pilot evaluating the benefits of an industry consortium network using distributed ledger technology, DLT, as an always-on solution. And the newly merged TAG will continue the project. And it's important to understand that while this is a UK initiative at the moment, it is a global challenge that we're looking to address, not just the UK one. And we have global companies participating. So discussions really are on a global scale, and all eyes really are watching the UK and this initiative to see how it pans out. So the concept is a DLT platform sitting under an industry consortium network, governed and operated by trade associations and industry representatives. The network defines the minimum requirements for participants to become trusted business partners and uses the platform to enforce their ongoing implementation or live compliance. Now, I've talked quite a bit there. I'm going to stop talking and actually hand over, and I'm going to ask some questions of our fabulous guests that I introduced at the beginning, Nigel Vaz and Tim Brown. So I'm going to jump in with some questions. I hope you guys are ready. So Nigel, first one for you. What would you say are the kind of the issues that digital advertising is facing?
I think in the context of everything you've talked about, Jules, when you think about programmatic specifically, right? We know programmatic grew about 6 billion in 2019, is projected to grow, 8 billion in 2021, and is going to continue to evolve in that direction. And one of the challenges that you have is just because there's more data, it doesn't necessarily mean we have more access to it or we know how to use it. So what's starting to happen is we've got very complex individual supply chains, we've got lots of technology intermediaries, all of which which has created a concern because of the lack of transparency, data standardization. You referred to the ISBA PwC study, which found, that there were real challenges in the context of display advertising, but similarly, the CMA, the Competition and Markets Authority, issued a warning to government that, Google and Facebook in particular have got now such unassailable market positions that nobody can compete on equal terms in terms of rivals. And so there's a lot of challenge in this specific aspect of digital advertising, simply because you've got a couple of very big companies that are dominating the space, but you've also got lots of fragmentation in terms of standards and technology.
Absolutely. That's a great descriptor. So what have you seen, and what would you say the industry has been doing to kind of resolve some of those issues?
I think when you think about any market which is fragmented, not really kind of governed, has been dominated by a couple different players, right? What you often see is you have to start with things like standards, certifications, regulations, just to establish some form of baseline. The trade associations have done a good job at creating some of these standards to move the industry forward, but there has also been a lot of education in terms of industry participants about best practices, about standards. And then you need some form of certification so that that companies are actually adhering to some of these standards. The biggest challenge, of course, in this context is traditional process doesn't apply, as you saw from a lot of the testimony that happened in front of Congress in the US, right? A lot of these decisions are made by technology, by algorithms, and there's a constant, refrain about the ability to be able to influence algorithms. And so one of the big things that we'd have to think about is how do we actually bring a technological enforcement mechanism to what is essentially a technological problem, as opposed to simply process and governance. So thinking about this idea of a permission-based network to take the industry to the next level and provide trades with the tools to ultimately hold everybody accountable. So, I think as you talk specifically about the JIC-Webs, rebranding as TAG, I mean, the whole idea there is to create a very self-regulatory program, but that at its core is effectively trying to certify the supply chain and create some form of governance that can constantly evolve.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, that we can as an industry self-regulate, but we need to be able to prove that we're doing so and ensure that we enforce that. So looking at the initiative at the DLT pilot that we've been running, what would you say are what makes that unique compared to what we've been doing to date?
I think, look, anything that starts in the context of enforcement that's always on accountable and self-regulation needs some way to constantly evolve to the changing standards. So I think the first thing that's actually really interesting here is that in addition to defining a cross-industry body that defines standards and best practices for digital advertising, we've identified a company in Fiducia, and obviously we'll hear more about that. But a company that we can essentially look at from pilot perspective and then potentially scale, which is primarily based on distributed ledger technologies you talked about earlier, or blockchain, to effectively boost the efficiency and transparency of digital advertising. For me, the focus of this project is ultimately about digital advertising, payments, and reconciliation in the supply chain, which is the primary focus of the pilot, not personal data. But of course, you could see it scaling to, other things like that. And for me, I think the real opportunity here is the internet made, information accessible to everyone. What we're hoping is blockchain as a technology more broadly, and in this pilot, we'll start to create that accountability for the transactional aspects of the internet, so that we can actually sort of say a digital advertising industry with its complex supply chain, you can now start to get multiple benefits from the introduction of an industry-wide consortium powered ultimately by technology, by linking the data of participants to transactions across that supply chain, and then allowing you to reconcile it in near real time based on pre-agreed principles. Because this idea of the shared truth, what is reality, is one of the biggest challenges you have currently. There's no common form of reality, and this is exactly what DLT as an idea was designed to solve, without one potential mediating authority, not just in this context, but it's a shared truth across an industry or a number of participants governed by a sort of a system that is kind of the keeper of that point of view. And so what it does is it forces us to become more transparent in line with real demanding regulatory requirements, and do that in a way that allows us to regain the trust I think that we've lost to some extent because of the proliferation of how things have evolved and the lack of transparency and fair competition.
Yeah, I think you make some really strong points. I think one thing that's really interesting when you talk about ability to scale, I think that it's important, as we are a global industry, that we are running an initiative that can scale, but also that continue to scale, as this is an industry that moves so quickly that we need technology that can move as fast as the industry. And also you make the point about trust and transparency and how important that is, and that we've made some inroads with standards and self-regulation, but really there's so much more to do. And again, the same thing with the shared truth, that what I see is what you see, I think is so important, and something that DLT really brings to the industry. So I think that you've defined really well there kind of what the issues and the challenges that the industry are facing, and how perhaps this initiative can help that. So I wanted actually to sort of move on and ask you, Tim, some questions around actually why we think that this is a solution, why the pilot that we've been running could basically be a solution to these challenges. But first of all, do you think you could basically sort of explain what DLT is? Remind everyone again what it stands for, and just tell us what it is.
Yeah, good question. I living and breathing this every day, I constantly forget that there needs to be a bit of some context and explanation. So DLT is distributed ledger technology, and it's probably a term that is not as used as much. Blockchain is one that's used more, but there is a difference. And so probably I'll start off by saying what this is not. Blockchain is a type of DLT in the same way that, for example, an electric car is a type of car. So think about DLT as kind of the broader term, and especially now that there are many different companies coming up with different DLT protocols that actually don't involve a blockchain. The other thing that's important is that people associate blockchain or DLT with cryptocurrencies. They're very different things. So DLT is required to power cryptocurrencies, the most popular one being Bitcoin. And blockchain is the underlying infrastructure that supports it. What's happened over the last years, and DLT is not necessarily a new technology, is the realization that DLT has got significant benefits to different use cases and to industry, to enterprise. And so, you commonly hear about blockchain being public. Everyone sees everything. And that's something which an enterprise sometimes, and especially in our industry, just doesn't work. And so, you heard Nigel talk about a permission-based network, which is a real important distinction. So the idea here is that, participants to the network are invited or asked to join, and have to adhere to minimum requirements that are set by the governing body. So big difference between public versus permissioned, and within permissioned, the data you have access to is on a need-to-know basis rather than everyone seeing everything.
What does it mean, so then, centralized versus decentralized? What's the difference between?
Yeah, so the difference between centralized and decentralized is basically DLT is a type of database, and in a centralized situation, you'd have one common database that everyone access to, And that has some challenges around, who controls that central database, the level of security, the points of failure, and so on. And so what DLT is a type of database where there's multiple organizations that use to share data between each other. And the basic features of it is, as I mentioned, one is that there's no one that has full control. It's agreed through a consensus mechanism. There's no single point of failure, so there's less prone to cyber attacks, failures, and fraud. You basically can authenticate the people who are participating or the legal identities that are part of the network, and what they're reporting, and make sure that what they're reporting to the network is immutable and can't be changed, and there's an auditable record of that. And then you've probably heard of things like, smart contracts, which functionality that sits on top of DLT, which basically is a fancy word for being able to kind of automatically monitor, execute, and enforce agreed terms. So, in essence, is you would know what has actually happened, who reported it, agree on what is actually counted, and you would see what everyone else sees within the end-to-end transaction, so on a need-to-know basis.
Okay, so one of the things that I've heard, especially when we first started the pilot and talking about DLT, was speed and scale, and whether we're actually, because of the huge amounts of data that flow through the supply chain, could DLT actually provide that speed and scale? So is that something that we're actually able to do?
Yeah, we get that a lot, and we've had the one of hurting the environment as well, which are things that are true about the Bitcoin and blockchain specifically, and the way that that's been set up and architectured. But it's come a long way, and enterprise solutions, permission-based networks are very, very different. But even with enterprise solutions, there's specific requirements that the advertising industry has, that are far beyond what we've seen in any other industry. So, to give you an example, Visa, I think, recorded the highest number of transactions in a DLT network, and that was 65,000. We in the advertising industry have to deal with millions per second, not 65,000, and it needs to scale significantly. The other big problem is cost. So the whole idea that DLT is very expensive, and therefore, is it actually worth it? If the expenses are going to outweigh the benefits. Within where this has been very popular in finance and insurance, and in those kind of industries where transactions is worth thousands or tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands, in our industry we're talking about an impression. A transaction is worth a fraction of a penny. So those are significant challenges. We at Fiducia have spent the last 3 years really working on addressing those from a technical point of view, and have done. And as part of as you well know, as part of the evaluation committee, independent evaluation committee is set up. Requirements were defined, and those were met by the technology. Also important to say that we've actually partnered with a company called R3 that has a DLT platform or protocol called Corda. And their advances in the technology has really helped in meeting the requirements of the industry as well.
So that's great to hear, because I know, as you said, that's often the question is, but can we deal with the speed and scale? So it sounds like that's absolutely something that we can do. And we obviously, I mentioned at the beginning that that really what the challenge that we're trying to address here is obviously resolving some of the trust and transparency challenges that we continue to have. So, you know, it's a basic question, you know, can the DLT network actually resolve and help us address those challenges of trust and transparency?
Yeah, sure. And you know, I think you've addressed some of those, and Nigel has as well. And you know, I'll talk a bit more about the pilot, the extensive pilot that we have actually run over the last year or so. But just, you know, generally in terms of how DLT can resolve the trust and transparency problem, you know, you know, first of all, it's important to say that it's not an easy thing to put in place, because, you know, it requires everyone to participate. You've, I'm sure, heard this a lot, where, you know, DLT is you know, it's all about collaboration. You know, it requires everyone to participate before anyone actually can get any value. So, you know, therefore, it's a big challenge, and you know, one in our view that can only be sort of done if it's actually thought through very carefully. You know, it's an independent organization that you know, really leads the initiative to get everyone to participate. You know, and that there's the right governance in place, and that's something that you know, we should be able to achieve through it being an industry-owned and operated network. You know, JICWebs and now TAG being involved, and having representation in the governance of all of the parts of the industry, from advertiser agency to technology vendors and publishers. So, you know, the governance roles and responsibilities are absolutely key. But then how does that work? So, you know, you talked about trusted business partners. So, you know, what does it exactly mean? So basically, you know, companies within the ecosystem would have to register with the network operator, the independent network operator, TAG. You know, and to do so would have to meet minimum requirements of participation. So there's a master level agreement that would have to be signed to you know, become a trusted partner. And it seems quite simple, but just having that legal identity and having that check, you know, is a big step forward in dealing with a lot of the challenges that we currently have in the industry, because there's a record of, you know, I suppose it's a bit like in the financial industry, knowing your customer. So, you know, going through those checks to ensure that there is a legal identity that you're dealing with that's actually accountable, where there is an email address, a person, et cetera, which, you know, in many cases doesn't happen today. So once you have that, the idea is that, you know, a participant becomes part of the network. So that's where you become part of the DLT network, where you have to deploy, you know, some technology, which then allows you to connect with all other participants within the ecosystem. You know, and that's where you know, so once you have that, then you can start to actually share data amongst yourselves in a more secure and easy, efficient way. You can then, you know, as I mentioned before, make sure that there's a mutable record of all that data, that you can start to share business logic in real time and always on, which arrives at that, you know, shared truth that Nigel talked about. And that drives, you know, two things. One is accountability, which is really what we're talking around trust and transparency. But, you know, I'd like to think about it more as accountability and compliance to individual supply chains. So what I mean by that is, you know, if an advertiser or an agency is working with X number of vendors, that it's that supply chain that is actually accountable and sharing data end to end. But the other thing we found in the pilot, which is probably as big or if not bigger, are business efficiencies. So just by automating or sharing the data and the business logic and automation, it really drives significant business efficiency across the whole supply chain.
I think,
yeah.
Sorry, I was going to say, I think you make some really interesting points there, and I think it's a simple point, but the sort of the trusted, the fact that it's permission-based network, that you have trusted business partners, could eradicate some of the challenges that we have almost straight away, but just ensuring that absolutely that who you're dealing with is a trusted partner. So I think that it's so important. And again, as you're saying, it's the accountability and compliance that we're missing that it can bring in, which I think again will really help address those trust and transparency problems. One of the things that you mentioned is collaboration, and how really it's so key for us to have the industry collaborate in order for this to be successful and to enable it to scale as well. So one of the things always when you're trying to get an industry to collaborate, as the questions are going to, what's in it for me, how am I going to benefit, and what's it going to cost me? So what are we looking at from the pilot and all the work that you guys have been putting in at Fiducia? What are kind of expected benefits and the costs for the participants across the supply chain?
Yeah, and important question. I mean, the adoption is key, and making sure you're incentivizing everyone in the supply chain to participate is absolutely key. And so I think what we found throughout this whole process, and I think the evaluation committee did as well, is that there's on the one hand significant benefit to the industry as a whole. In really trying to help some of the issues that were mentioned earlier on around, consumer trust, the government trust in the industry, and trust amongst industry participants. So there's some, general benefits across the entire industry, but there's also importantly, benefits for everyone across the supply chain. Which is important to make sure that everyone actually participates. And I think those people who have been able to spend a bit more time looking at this and seeing this in the pilot have recognized that. But because this is all very new, it's important that we do more education, and really be able to demonstrate, to all participants in the industry how they will benefit. And I hope this is a start of it, and hopefully there's more to come, in the coming weeks. But the key thing, as we went into this was that the benefits really had to outweigh the cost of ownership to the industry. And we've always been working, with the evaluation committee, and JICWebs on this kind of idea that it needs to be cost efficiency of 1 to 30. So for every pound spent, there needs to be at least 30 pounds return in some way or another. So if we look at the benefits, they fall, and I'll go through it in more detail in later on when we talk about the pilot. But there's 5 key areas. So one is reduction of business risk. The other is, increase of value. The third is, increase in revenue, reduction in cost, and then reduction in working capital. And if you look at the different participants in the ecosystem, whether it's advertisers, agency, tech vendors, or publishers, the value of each of those is slightly different. But there's definitely value for all in the ecosystem. We've actually, as part of the pilot, is kind of modeled out what we think some of those efficiency gains are in our industry. And Nigel mentioned the size of the market, $6 billion market. I mean, we're talking about you know, the addressable part of it at this stage is probably about 2 billion, and you know, efficiency gains of over 640 million. So, you know, a significant amount, about 30% of what the current spend is. And then in terms of the cost, you know, we've always thought about this as well as, you know, similar to, for those of you who know ASBOF, or, you know, if you're not in the industry, the important thing is that this was a very, very small charge, you know, across everyone in the industry to, you know, to make sure that it you know, there was no disincentive to participate. So we've always modeled this, you know, as you well know, at making sure that the cost of this to the industry is less than 1% of every pound spent.
Okay, so one of the things I always think, you know, with our industry, with the digital ad industry, has grown incredibly quickly, and you know, has generated huge revenues. But we're still quite a young industry. We've only been around for about 25 years, I think it is now. And I think it's always important, isn't it, to look at other industries to see what, you know, what they've done, how they've implemented things, what successes they've had. And I know you mentioned that you work with R3. So are there any kind of other successful examples in other industries that we've been able to look at and learn from?
Yeah, sure. I mean, it's you know, it's interesting. So if you look specifically at the enterprise permissioned network space, I think the leaders in that space are IBM with Hyperledger and R3 Corda, and they've, you know, in the case of R3 Corda specifically, you know, being successful in finance and insurance, you know, mainly because of their history, and that it was actually something that started with a consortium of banks, which I think well, has been a very interesting case study for us to look at and learn, and, you know, learn from, you know, some of their mistakes and, you know, some of the things that have gone well to help us with, you know, what we're trying to do here. But, you know, there's you know, there's well over, you know, between them over 1,000 projects delivering significant value. I mean, it's still early stage, but it's growing very, very quickly. You know, as I said, finance and insurance are probably leading the way, but you know, hopefully we can add advertising to that list in the not so near future, and be seen as kind of the leaders and innovators of using this technology. You know, I would encourage you to go to the Corda, you know, or IBM website to actually, you know, there's plenty of case studies out there. You know, an anecdote which you know, was really interesting for me and an eye-opener. Corda or R3 organized an annual event called CordaCon. And, you know, 2018 was all about what this potentially could do, and it was all theoretical. And in the last one, which is 2019, you know, I don't know what's happened with COVID and when the next one is, but it was incredible how it had developed within only 12 months. It was, you know, suddenly it was just case study after case study of live projects that were actually delivering significant value. It was you know, a very exciting day. I was a bit like a kid in a candy shop, but it was yeah, it was really interesting.
Yeah, they're definitely an impressive business, and yeah, it is. I think the digital ad industry often looks to the finance industry for learnings, and yeah, it's really been interesting to see what they've been doing with the kind of similar incentives. So I wanted to kind of move on and actually talk a little bit about the industry pilot and the findings. But I wanted to sort of move on to Nigel, who's been sitting there patiently while Tim's been doing his bit. But no, obviously, Nigel, is your role as president of the IPA, which obviously is the trade association for the agencies in the ad industry. How supportive have you found the IPA members to be for this initiative?
Look, I think all of our members have been extraordinarily supportive, because anything that brings transparency and standardization to the industry, I think, is going to be appreciated by everybody. The big four networks, Publicis Media, which is part of Publicis Group, which is what I'm part of, the company I run is part of, Group M, part of WPP, OMG, and Dan are all the leading independent media agencies. Havas and IPG have been part of the process. And then there's 5 major advertisers, so Unilever, Nestle, McDonald's, Virgin Media, and O2, and their agencies, so Mindshare, Zenith, OMG, and Havas are participating in the pilot. And for me, what's exciting about this is, of course, if the pilot is successful, TAG will consult with all of the broader industry and how we widen the scope of this project to make it more inclusive, to start to effectively really get to the core question about interventions that we can take that specifically target every aspect of the journey in the context of digital advertising to make it more and more transparent on an ongoing basis.
Yeah, it's been fabulous actually to see how the agencies have really leaned into this project, and you know, they've had to put a lot of time, resource into, you know, helping us get this off the ground and participating. So it's been great to see. And I think, you know, we have seen the rest of the industry be largely supportive of this. Obviously, always some exceptions, but, you know, I think there's definitely a lot of interest. I think key to this initiative has always been education and communication, because it is a complex area. And I think different parts of the industry, different stakeholders at different levels need to understand at a different, you know, the different depths of it. And it can take a while. I know it took me a while to get my head around it all. And sometimes still I sort of have to question a few things. So, you know, I think the industry is supportive. I think always when we introduce new things into the industry, you get those who are happy to want to jump on right at the start, and they want to be part of it. They want to be leaders. They want to be future facing, and we get others who always want to sit back and watch a little bit and see how it progresses. So I think we've seen a mixture of those, but I think largely the industry can see, well, I think you would say the whole industry is leaning into trust and transparency with standards. You know, we have, you know, pretty much 95% of the industry signed up to the brand safety standard. But yes, I think that's really been interesting. But I think what would be great, Tim, is if you could kind of talk a little bit more about what the pilot has actually achieved and some of the challenges that we faced sort of along the way, because I think, you know, we've made, you know, great steps forward with this, but it has been difficult. A lot of that has been around the education side of things as well. But yeah, so perhaps you could talk us through, achievements and challenges. That would be great to hear.
Yeah, sure. I think, you know, when I first spoke to you, Jules, and your board, you know, a few years ago, you know, I think the first proposal was a 3-month pilot, which I think, well, in hindsight was crazy. So, you know, we've actually started this in March 2019. The pilot's run for over a year. You know, as you say, it hasn't been easy, but you know, generally, you know, the participation has been great. And you know, I do want to thank, you know, everyone in the supply chain, you know, who has participated. You know, the way I like to think about it is more the glass half full. So I think, you know, generally, you know, everyone's positive around the intent and the goals. You know, there was a willingness to participate, you know, but there were some legal and technical challenges, you know, along the way. You know, just taking a step back, just, you know, this, you know, I keep on having to remind myself as well that, you know, when I speak to our 3/4 about this, you know, this is one of the biggest DLT network pilots, you know, not only in our industry, but across other industries. So it's been, you know, a significant piece of work, you know, and, you know, a great start to really take this to the next level. So, you know, just as a quick reminder, the goals were really to evaluate the benefits of DLT from an accountability and compliance point of view, and from a business value and operational efficiency. And then the other is, you know, what would it take to launch a network? So what was the, you know, appetite of the industry? What were the commercial, legal, and technical issues that needed to be overcome? You know, there's a over 50-page document that will be shared with everyone shortly, so keep an eye out for that. But just some of the, you know, really top highlights. is that, as I said, there is some work to be done around, data access and consent, and standards of DLT, standards for a DLT network to be implemented properly. And I was glad to see the ISBA report. They face similar problems, and there's some follow-ups and actions on the back of that to try and address some of those access and standard challenges. So the key findings that I kind of mentioned, earlier on, but really from an advertiser point of view, what we saw is that by DLT providing sort of kind of data in a more timely fashion, that there's that money could be much better allocated, and we're talking about on average across all of them up to 34% of their spend. So we're talking about 680 million pounds if we're looking at a 2 billion addressable market. When it comes to publishers, what is interesting is that 45% of publisher domains deliver qualified impression rates of over 90% and 20% of domains below 40%. The importance of, we saw this with ISBA PwC, rather than actually, running across 40,000 domains, is really focusing on, on the domains that, are going to be trusted partners and are going to deliver you what you're looking for. And then lastly, which I mentioned earlier on, which I think is one of the biggest findings, is just the significant operation efficiencies. We interviewed over 40 practitioners in programmatic advertising, and they're spending more than half of their time downloading, formatting, reconciling data that could be automated with DLT. And also the fact that that's manual, it's leading to or reconciled data actually not being available in real time, and making it available in real time is actually driving significant business value to the industry.
Fabulous. So there's lots of information that we've talked about there, and as we've said often, it can take a while for everyone to get their head around, but hopefully that's been a good explainer of DLT and some of the work that's been done. So I guess really it's probably a good idea for me to say, where we're moving next, because there's been a huge amount of work that's been put in, both by JICWebs as was, and by Fiducia, and also by, as we mentioned, all of the stakeholders. But yes, I just really wanted to share what's next for what is now the tag DLT. So the next step is for the newly merged tag to actually launch an industry-wide consultation to share the detailed information about the initiative, some of which obviously Tim has mentioned today, alongside all the pilot findings, and to enable the industry really to give their input so that we can better define how to move forward with this initiative. I think, we've mentioned a couple of times today how key collaboration is. We need the industry to move as one, and move on this journey together. So it's important for the industry to have a voice in that. So we'll be launching this consultation in association with the 4 trade bodies, ISBA, AOP, IPA and IAB UK. That will launch on the 16th of September and will run for 6 to 8 weeks. And the goal of that industry consultation is really to move the pilot into the next, even more exciting phase, which is the most viable ecosystem, which is kind of like a beta test for the industry. And we're hoping to do that in January of 2021. And that would then lead us into the launch of a DLT platform sitting under an industry consortium network, hopefully later next year. So it's a very exciting period that we're moving into, and that that we hope to take the industry with us. So that being said, really I'd like to thank I'm going to say my guests. I'm not sure that you're my guest, but the rest of the panel. So thank you very much, Nigel Vaz, and also to Tim Brown. And also thank you to everyone who's tuned in and watched and listened. We appreciate your time. Thank you. Thank you, guys.
Perfect. Thanks,
Thank you.
Thanks, Tom.
Thank you.